Rain had been falling in Seattle for 3 days straight, and that night was the coldest of the year. Clara Jensen stepped into a dim bar tucked between bookstores and tattoo parlors in Capitol Hill, wearing a threadbare canvas coat and carrying a heart too bruised to keep hiding its hurt. Outside, the rain lashed against the pavement like it was trying to scrape memories off the earth. Inside, the amber lighting was dull and far from cozy, but at least it offered the illusion of not being invisible. Clara wanted nothing more than a dark corner and a drink strong enough to burn. She slid onto a stool at the far end of the bar, fingers trembling from the cold. Her damp hair clung to her cheeks. When the bartender asked what she wanted, she whispered, "Whatever's strongest." The man 2 seats down didn't speak. He only glanced at her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. And Clara, in the instant she looked up, caught his gaze, steel cold and heavy with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from carrying things no one can see. Julian Hart, the name her college roommates used to murmur at parties. A tech genius, founder of a billion-dollar company. The kind of man who didn't belong anywhere near heartbreak, but somehow wore it like a second skin. He lifted his glass, signaled for another, and with the faintest tilt of his head, invited her over. Clara hesitated for just one breath, then slid her stool closer. They sat together for nearly an hour, barely speaking. A quiet between them, not awkward, just necessary. Sometimes the silence of 2 strangers says more than any conversation. She didn't ask his name. He didn't ask hers. They simply existed, side by side, like 2 people hiding from the same storm. When Julian finally murmured, "You look like you're trying to forget something," Clara almost laughed at the truth of it. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe you are, too." There was no offer, no pressure, just the look he gave her as he stood and reached out his hand. Something in that silence felt safer than anything she'd known in months. And Clara, for reasons she wouldn't admit even to herself, took it. A sleek black car waited outside. Neither of them spoke on the ride. In a penthouse suite overlooking a city blurred by rain, Clara let him peel away her soaked layers and for a few hours forgot who she was supposed to be. That night was both gentle and wild. No love, no lies, just skin and silence, a temporary kind of safety between 2 people lost in their own ruins. By the time the sky began to brighten, Clara woke in his arms. Julian was still asleep, one arm slung across her waist. She eased out from under him, dressed in silence, and left behind a single embroidered handkerchief on the armchair. She told herself it was just one night. He'd forget. So would she. But some nights leave a mark that even time can't undo. A year after that rain-soaked night, Clara Jensen stood before the wrought iron gates of a sprawling estate nestled atop a hill north of Seattle. In her hand was a battered suitcase with one broken wheel and a frayed handle. Her heart beat too fast, like it was arriving before the rest of her could catch up. She never imagined she'd return to this city, let alone take a job in a place that looked like a fairy tale, or a trap depending on the day. An old friend, Nora, a curator for private collections, had called her weeks ago with an offer. The Hart Estate's private library was hiring a full-time manager. Good pay, housing included, and peace. For Clara, it wasn't just a job, it was oxygen. She needed the money. For Sophie, her fragile little sister who lived on inhalers and borrowed time. And more than that, Clara needed a place quiet enough to let her forget who she used to be. The gate creaked open. A long stone path curved through maple trees, still wearing the last red leaves of autumn. The mansion emerged through the morning fog, tall, elegant, and too still, like it had been waiting. A butler escorted her inside, past glossy wooden floors and paintings older than her name. "Miss Jensen, this will be your workspace," he said, leading her into a grand room lined with towering shelves. "Mr. Hart will see you sometime this weekend." Clara nodded, grateful for the delay. but fate rarely waits. That afternoon, while reorganizing a shelf near the window, she heard quiet footsteps behind her. She turned, and the world shifted on its axis. Julian Hart stood just a few feet away, phone in hand, eyes locked on hers. He didn't look surprised, just still, as if searching for something long misplaced. Clara's body froze. She dropped her gaze instantly, pretending to look for something under the desk. He didn't speak, didn't move. After a beat, he simply glanced once more and turned away. But in his eyes, brief and sharp, she saw something flicker. Recognition, maybe, or suspicion. Clara closed the door to her office behind her, heart pounding so hard she was sure someone might hear it. She leaned her forehead against the wooden frame, breath ragged, trying to erase the image of the man who had just looked at her like he could see through every layer she had carefully built. Julian Hart. There was no mistaking him. Even in the filtered light of late afternoon, she recognized those eyes. The same ones she had once seen in the dark of a rainy night, beneath breathless pauses and a touch too tender to forget. She never expected him to still live here, and she certainly hadn't expected to walk right into his world again. In the days that followed, Clara became meticulous in avoiding him. She memorized the shortcuts between corridors, only worked in the library when she knew he was elsewhere. At the slightest echo of approaching footsteps, she would pivot away or pretend to be deep in a phone call. Every glimpse of him from a distance made her chest tighten, not because she feared he'd recognize her, but because she wasn't ready to recognize what still stirred inside herself. She was sure he hadn't figured it out yet. But deep down, she knew, if the day came when he remembered, she wasn't certain she could survive it. Keeping the secret was the only way to hold on to what she had now, a job, a roof, and a chance to save Sophie. Love, if it ever meant anything, had to stay locked away, far behind her. And Clara knew the quiet beginning she had hoped for wouldn't last long. Julian Hart was the kind of man who could walk into a room without making a sound, and still the air would shift around him. Clara felt it every time he passed near the library, like a ripple she couldn't see but always felt. He rarely visited the collection, but when he did, she couldn't breathe. Sometimes he'd glance at the portraits lining the wooden staircase. Sometimes he'd pause, fingers brushing the spine of an antique volume, before walking away without a word. She wasn't sure if he truly remembered her. Julian had the eyes of someone always lost in things far beyond the room he stood in. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that every glance from him saw more than it should. One afternoon, while sorting a set of delicate art prints, she knocked over a stack of drawings, papers scattered like startled birds across the floor. She bent down to gather them, but a hand reached first, faster than hers, steadier. Julian. "Careful," he said, his voice low and even, not cold, just neutral, like dipping a toe in unfamiliar waters. Clara looked up, just for a second, then dropped her gaze. She whispered a thank you, too soft for the room. He nodded once and didn't look back as he walked away. It was a moment so small it should have vanished with the afternoon light. But that night, Clara couldn't sleep. His presence clung to her hands like static. His eyes, searching, uncertain, as if chasing a memory still out of reach, refused to leave her mind. She realized she was no longer afraid of him. She was afraid of herself, afraid that if he looked at her for 1 second longer, she might look back, not with her eyes, but with her heart. Clara had never intended to bring Sophie here. The plan was simple: stay long enough to send money back, hire a nurse, and keep her little sister safe from afar. But plans rarely survive reality. Sophie arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, coughing violently, her backpack heavy with medicine bottles and sketchbooks. Clara opened the back door and nearly screamed at the sight of her, soaked, shivering, her lips pale, breath shallow. "How did you get here? Who did you run from?" Sophie's voice was a whisper. "I missed you." Clara's heart cracked open. There was no time for scolding. She pulled her sister inside, wrapped her in blankets, made ginger tea. But that night, listening to Sophie wheeze in her sleep, Clara knew she couldn't send her back. Not yet. She cleared out a corner in the supply closet next to the library. An old, quiet space no one visited. Laid down a mattress, a few blankets, and a small reading lamp. Sophie called it the secret cave. For 3 days they managed. Clara smuggled food, meds, and comic books between shifts. She worked as usual by day, but every night her chest tightened with the weight of what could go wrong. And then it did. On Friday evening, Clara was bringing a bowl of soup down the hallway when she nearly collided with Julian. He stood still, like he'd been there for a while. His eyes drifted from the tray in her hands to the small door behind her, where Sophie was sleeping. "What are you hiding, Clara?" His voice wasn't angry, just quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he already knew. She stepped back until her shoulders hit the wall. "Please, don't tell anyone." Julian didn't reply. He opened the door. Sophie sat up slowly, wide-eyed, her fevered face fragile and too quiet. Something flickered across Julian's face. Not shock, but recognition of a truth he hadn't yet named. Clara dropped to her knees beside her sister, taking her tiny hand. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. Julian didn't call for staff, didn't ask questions. He only said, voice tight with restraint, "Pack her things. She's moving to the west guest room." Clara looked up, heart hammering. "What are you doing?" He didn't meet her eyes. "She sees a doctor, first thing tomorrow." Then he turned, already walking. And Clara understood. The secret had unraveled. But instead of disaster, something else had begun. Unclear, but not entirely unwelcome. That night, sleep didn't come. Not because of fear, because for the first time she wasn't sure if she was still hiding or being seen. Clara had never stepped into Julian's private wing until that morning. His room on the 3rd floor was off-limits to most. But that day, the housekeeper handed her a rare instruction. Change the bedding in the master suite. "Mr. Hart leaves for New York this afternoon," she said. "Be quick. Leave no trace." Clara nodded, keeping her face neutral. But as she stepped through the door, her breath caught in her chest. The room was perfectly still. Everything in its place, as if even time bowed to the quiet authority inside. Shelves in symmetry, warm lamplight on dark wood, a breeze slipping in from the lake through a cracked window. She moved through the task quickly, trying not to look too closely. But as she smoothed the final blanket, something caught her eye. A white dress shirt draped over the back of a leather chair near the window. Clean, pressed, but at the collar, a faint faded smudge. Not red, not fresh. Blush, pink, like a whisper of something soft that had once been bold. Clara stepped closer. Her hand trembled as her fingers hovered over the fabric. She remembered, so clearly, that rainy night, the way she had leaned into him, kissed his neck in the dark, her lipstick leaving that exact trace. A voice behind her broke the stillness. "That doesn't belong to you." Julian stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His tone wasn't angry, just precise. Clara spun around, pale. She opened her mouth, but the words tangled. Julian took a step closer, then another, measured, cautious, like he wasn't sure which sentence would crack the silence wide open. "Why are you looking at it like you left something there?" Clara looked up, cornered by truth. "Because I did," she whispered. "That night. It was me." The silence between them grew dense, as if every word unsaid hung heavy in the air, pressing in from all sides. Julian didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, unblinking, unshielded. "I went back to that bar," he said finally, his voice rough and low, like the words hurt coming out. "Every weekend, for 3 months. I asked about you, described you, until the manager told me to stop, said you were just a ghost." Clara's hands clenched, nails digging into her palms. "Why?" she whispered, not sure she was ready for the answer. Julian drew in a slow breath, eyes never leaving hers. "Because you didn't leave anything. No name, no number. Just emptiness. And I couldn't live with that." Clara bit her lip, then spoke, barely audible. "I was scared. It was the first time. I did something with no plan, no logic, no armor. I thought if you knew who I really was, you'd hate me. So I left, before you could." Julian stepped closer. His breath touched the space between them like a question. "I don't hate you. Because you don't know me well enough. I want to?" Clara stepped out of his room in silence. The hallway breeze brushed her hair, but it wasn't as cold as the feeling unraveling inside her. He had looked for her, not once, not out of curiosity, but because the emptiness she left behind had been unbearable. She had never imagined being someone's absence, someone's ache, especially not for Julian Hart, a man the world saw in headlines but never truly touched. Yet she had marked him. Without meaning to, she had left a scar he couldn't forget. She didn't know if the tightness in her chest was relief or fear. Part of her wanted to go back in, to wrap herself in his arms, to whisper that she remembered too, that she never forgot. But another part of her wanted to run, because love, when it's real, always brings the fear of losing it. She had just realized she was no longer a stranger in his story. And at that exact moment, footsteps echoed across the gravel outside. A sleek car pulled up in front of the estate. The woman who stepped out looked too much like Julian to be anyone else. His mother had arrived. There was no need for introductions. Her face had graced Forbes covers, usually beside features, praising the empire she'd built with her late husband. Clara had never felt so small. She stepped back from the window. She shouldn't watch. She shouldn't care. But her heart already cared more than it should. Clara stood behind the glass door, heart hammering. She knew she shouldn't listen, but she couldn't walk away. Inside, the air was colder than the Seattle rain outside. Julian stood straight. Miranda sat, but her gaze made everyone else seem smaller. "So, this is where you've been," Miranda said, dropping her handbag onto the couch like an accusation. "Living with a housemaid?" Clara flinched. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Julian's voice was sharp but steady. "You don't get to talk about her like that." Miranda scoffed. "I do when your recklessness drags our name through the mud. What is she? A golden ticket? A one-night mistake you're now trying to polish into something respectable?" Clara took a step back. Each word landed like a blade. Julian stepped forward, shielding her with his body. His eyes no longer cold, just unyielding. "I love her, and if you can't accept that, you're welcome to return to New York today." Miranda stood, voice like ice. "You'll regret this. Girls like her don't stay. They take, then leave." Clara didn't wait to hear more. She turned away, each step heavier than the last. Her tears came not from shame, but from the aching truth she might never belong here. Clara sat alone in the small west parlor, where the last light of day filtered in through half-drawn curtains. She didn't know how long she'd been there, only that her chest still ached, like something had been crushed inside her. Miranda's words echoed in her mind, sharp and vivid as if carved into her skin. What is she? A mistake? A golden ticket? Clara had never been easily shaken, but this time felt different. The door creaked open. Julian stepped inside. She didn't look up, but he came anyway, sitting quietly beside her. "You're not a burden, Clara," he said softly, like he could hear her thoughts. She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Then why did I feel like a stain on a clean floor when she looked at me?" Julian paused, then reached for her hand. "My mother lives in a world where everything has a price. But you're not something to be priced." Clara gently pulled her hand away. Not rejection, just distance. If she had to leave, she'd do it before the feelings went any deeper. Clara didn't leave that night. She slid the small bag beneath her bed, zipped it tight, and let it sit there, silent, like a quiet reminder she still had a way out. And then came the knock at the door. Clara opened the door after the second knock. Julian stood there, shirt damp from a sudden rain, hair tousled by the wind. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, and this time there was nothing hidden in his eyes. "You deserve someone who isn't this complicated. I don't need perfect, I need real. And that's you." Her breath caught, her heart stretched between doubt and something dangerously close to belief. Julian stepped closer. His gaze was steady, quiet, certain. "I don't want you to stay out of kindness or duty. I want you to stay because I've loved you longer than I even realized." Clara felt her defenses crumble. There were no more walls to build. And when he leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, she didn't move. She let him kiss her. A kiss that wasn't rushed, but heavy with everything they'd lost. His arms wrapped around her waist. Her fingers clung to his shoulder like if she let go, they'd both disappear. That night, Clara didn't return to her room. No suitcase was dragged to the front door. No goodbye was spoken. Only two people, two breaths. And the quiet truth that finally, there was nothing left to hide. That night, Clara didn't just give herself to Julian, she gave away the part of her heart she had hidden from the world. There was no more hesitation from a love that once felt misplaced. No more distance built from fear. Just two souls who had once been lost, finding each other in their most fragile moment. And by morning, everything had changed. Julian was no longer the stranger from a stormy night. He was the one making her tea at dawn, the steady hand that held her when everything else threatened to fall apart. The first name Sophie laughed aloud. That night wasn't just a night, it was the beginning of a family no one saw coming. Something had shifted in Sophie's eyes after the surgery. A new light, like sunshine breaking through weeks of endless gray. She began to laugh more, calling Julian by name in a soft, lisping voice full of affection. Whenever Clara gave her medicine or changed her bandages, the little girl would turn and ask, "Where's Uncle Jules?" Julian never missed a single checkup. He learned to tell each medication apart, remembered every dose time, and even memorized Sophie's favorite lullaby before bed. One afternoon, Clara stood quietly in the hallway, watching through the living room glass. Sophie sat curled on Julian's lap, clutching her stuffed bear, babbling about a marshmallow kingdom where she insisted Julian would be crowned king, because he makes the best chocolate milk. Julian laughed, and his eyes were so gentle they made Clara's breath catch in her throat. No one had taught him how to be a father. No one told him how to place the pillows so Sophie could sleep easier, or how to wipe away her midnight tears when she woke from nightmares. And yet, he did all of it. No script, no manual, just heart. One day, Sophie tripped and scraped her knee in the backyard. Julian was the first to run to her. He didn't panic. He knelt down, scooped her up gently, and whispered, "You're okay. I'm right here." Clara stood behind the doorframe, her fingers curling around the wood, her throat tightening with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just because Julian was the man she loved. It was because he was the first person who made Sophie feel truly, unquestionably safe. That night, as Julian cradled Sophie with her head resting on his arm, telling the same fairy tale for the 100th time, Clara realized something. Sometimes family isn't born, it's chosen. And Julian, though not bound by blood, was exactly who Sophie needed most. Clara couldn't remember the last time she woke up without fear. Maybe it had been years ago, before the prescriptions, before the sleepless nights beside Sophie's hospital bed, before she'd walked into this mansion with her worn-out suitcase and trembling hands. But lately, mornings had begun to feel different. The panic didn't come first anymore. Instead, there was the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, the soft patter of Sophie's feet along the wooden hallway, and sometimes Julian's low voice from an early conference call, unhurried, unhidden. She started putting flowers in a vase, started folding the kitchen towels neatly, as if small things could keep the big ones from breaking. She found herself smiling when Julian bent to tie Sophie's shoelaces, or when he sat by the window reading quietly while she cleaned nearby. And she realized she was happy, not the loud, reckless kind of happy she once dreamed of as a girl, but a quiet happiness, slow and steady, one that crept in without asking and made her want to stay. Peace had always been a luxury for Clara, something she watched from a distance, never daring to reach for. And yet here she was, living inside it. No one chasing her, no looming fear of being fired, no constant dread that Sophie might not make it through another night. Just simple mornings, with laughter, gentle touches, shared glances, and hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run anymore. A week later, on a soft golden afternoon, Julian held Clara's hand as they passed through the wrought iron gates of the Hart Estate in Westbrook, a mansion once featured on the cover of an architectural magazine for its perfect blend of old-world elegance and modern design. Clara had always believed she didn't belong in places like this, with crystal chandeliers that nearly kissed the ceilings, hallways that seemed to stretch forever, and oil paintings worth more than any apartment she'd ever lived in. But Julian didn't let go of her hand. Not once. There was no hesitation, no hiding. "Grandmother's waiting," he said, his voice gentle, but carrying a weight far greater than a simple introduction. Clara's nerves danced under her skin as they entered the sitting room, where Eleanor Hart was already waiting. She wore a soft cream sweater and a simple string of pearls. Her silver hair was swept back neatly, and her eyes, bright and kind, seemed to hug Clara before she'd even spoken a word. "I'm Clara," she said softly, unable to fully hide her anxiety. "Julian says no one calms him the way you do," Eleanor replied with a warm smile of her own. "Thank you for that." Just one sentence, and something in Clara's chest came undone. Tension, fear, doubt. All of it loosened in an instant. Dinner passed in soft laughter and old stories, Eleanor recalling how Julian once climbed the roof to save a nest of baby birds, despite crying every time a cat passed by. Clara watched him flush beside her, sneaking glances her way with that twinkle in his eye she was starting to memorize. After dessert, Eleanor gently took Clara's hand in hers. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're not good enough for him," she said. "Love doesn't care where you come from. It only listens to the heart." On the drive home, Julian didn't speak much. He just held her hand a little tighter, as if he, too, was holding on to the quiet gratitude of being seen, accepted. Clara looked up at the starlit sky, and for the first time, not as a fantasy, not as a fleeting hope, she truly believed. Maybe she didn't have to hide anymore. Maybe she could belong here, just as she was. That afternoon, the Westbrook Lake was still as glass. The water glowed in the colors of sunset, lavender, gold, and soft orange, painting a quiet world as if brushed by breath, not hands. Clara sat on a wooden bench beneath a canopy of vines, her easel propped up beside her, gently adding strokes of color to an unfinished canvas. Sophie running through a field of reeds. A breeze caught a few strands of hair tickling her cheek. She smiled faintly, eyes still focused on her painting, as though the world had finally stopped screaming just long enough to let her breathe. She didn't notice when Julian arrived. He stood silently behind her, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. She turned slightly, sensing his breath near her shoulder. "How long have you been there?" she asked softly, still holding her brush. "Long enough to see that you always paint the world more beautifully than it is." Julian sat beside her. "But this time, it looks exactly like what's real." She looked at him, and the sunset deepened the brown of his eyes, softening every edge. He inhaled slowly and reached into his coat. From it, he pulled a small velvet box. Simple, understated, nothing flashy. He opened it, revealing a ring with a single, tiny diamond, clear as a frozen tear. "Clara," he began, voice unsteady but gaze unwavering. "I don't have the perfect words, just a heart that was lost until you walked in." Clara held her breath. "You didn't just save Sophie, you saved me. Every time you smile, every time you sit here and paint, every time you say my name without fear, you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves you." He knelt, his hands gently holding hers. "Will you marry me?" Clara couldn't speak at first. Tears flooded her eyes, uninvited and unstoppable. For a moment, her breath caught between fear and longing. Then she nodded, her trembling hands clutching his. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will. At that moment, a giggle rang out in the distance. Sophie, wearing a white dress and grass-stained shoes, ran toward them like a breeze, throwing her arms around them both. "Does this mean we're really a family now?" she asked, eyes gleaming like stars. Julian wrapped his arms around them. "We've always been a family," he said, voice low and full. Clara buried her face against his shoulder, heart beating in sync with these two souls, one who had once locked himself away, one who had once lay silent in a hospital bed, and herself, a woman who once believed she wasn't worth loving. That life was gone now. Only the sunset remained. Laughter, a future wide open before them, no fear, no fleeing. Because love doesn't knock. It waits in silence until we're quiet enough to let it in.